Hello, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for tuning into this episode of the OETV ESG interview series. I'm Sasha Chasen, here to bring you the best of OETV ESG today. And stay tuned, later we're interviewing Steven Bowen, founder and CEO of Sustainable Investing. But first on OETV ESG. Check out the newest episode of Net Zero Conversations led by LSEG's Group Head of Sustainability, Jane Goodland, featuring Sven Udermolen, RWE Renewables Offshore Wind Chief Executive Officer, here to discuss the company's roadmap towards net zero and the values of offshore wind. The conversation highlights RWE's growing green strategy, which includes ambitious plans to triple offshore wind capacity by 2030 and how it intends to become a net positive employer when it comes to biodiversity. As always, all of this and more is available right now on OETV ESG. Now we're joined by Steven Bowen, founder and CEO of Sustainable Investing. With 30 plus years of experience working in asset management with periods of corporate finance and debt markets, Steven leverages his knowledge to help clients better understand investable solutions. Whether you're a company manager working for a family office or endowment or part of investor relations or communications team, Sustainable Investing helps develop robust solutions for sustainability transition challenges by rooting them in your core values, giving the best chance of success by basing them in fact, not fantasy. Steven, welcome. Thank you. We're lucky to have you here today.
Thanks, Sasha. It's good to be here.
Great. Would you share a bit of your background and start off by just explaining how it really shaped the founding of Sustainable Investing?
Sure. I've been in the finance industry now for about 30 years, one way or another. And I've got a bit of an unusual career, and I think that was part of the driving behind sustainable investing, in that I've done all sorts of things in finance. I've done public and private equity, I've done fixed income, I've done bank debt, I've run debt books. And also before that, I spent about 7 or 8 years as an engineer. So I've got a very practical experience in building things and operating them, and that influences my way of thinking about the world a lot. And then I guess the other factor is, I grew up in New Zealand, and that gives you a different perspective on land use and environment and things like that. So that was the background. And then over the last 5 or 6 years, I've started working a lot more with small and mid-sized investors. And you start to realize that they have a very different perspective and very different set of problems. And then you particularly start to think about ESG and sustainability, and you realize that they're not really getting what they want. And at the same time, we're not really fixing the problems. So you put all of that together, and that was the genesis of sustainable investing.
Right. When it comes to sustainability related investment decisions, you spoke a little bit about this, working with clients like family offices, endowments, and charities. What do you think really are the advantages, challenges, and nuances of working with these clients? And in turn, how does it translate to the work you do with companies and asset managers?
Yeah, I think the disadvantages are pretty well known, in that if you're a large institution, the asset manager will go out and they will build you a solution. If you're a small institution, or even a mid-sized one that's pretty decent in terms of assets, you're really out there taking what is being given. You don't get a bespoke solution. So that's the challenge for them. I think the advantages are around focus and flexibility. Focus because they have a lot more ability to be able to say, actually, these are the problems we want to fix. These are the things we want to focus on, which you can't with a large institution. And then flexibility, if they identify something that they want to be involved with, they can then start to think about what's the best mechanism. Can it be public equity or private equity or debt? And they are not limited as a large institution, by the liquidity constraints. And then the last bit of flexibility, of course, is that, they can say, I'm prepared to take a longer term view. I'm prepared to push out my returns so that I get the solution that I want. And I might mean foregoing some short-term gains, as at the moment with the way the market's going, but that's the way that I want to align with my values. The nuance is kind of interesting, because this is going to sound a bit weird. You're dealing with people, and I know you're dealing with people in larger institutions as well, but these are people who are used to having the ability to actually do something when they want to make a difference. And they're people who are used to having quite strong opinions. They know what their family values are, or they know what their endowment is trying to achieve. And so this is a bit more complex and a bit more subtle than working with a large institution where they're often thinking about just risk and return trade-off and some sort of simplistic ESG scoring. And then when you think about how that flows through into companies and asset managers, it's all the different sides of the same coin. So for an asset manager, we're able to work with them in a similar sort of way, but to try and help them pick up what it is that their clients want and what their clients are thinking about. Because that's often, as an asset manager, you're often quite detached from that process. And then for a company, it's even more obvious because you're then starting to help them understand what is it that an asset manager or an asset owner wants from their investment, and how can you start to put together a sustainability strategy that meets all of those needs, and how do you communicate that properly? And communication is something that I think we'll come back to a lot because it's at the core of what we try and do.
Right, as you mentioned a bit, really getting at the human crux of where ESG might be currently missing a bit. We talk a lot about ESG box checking. We talk a lot about, making sure that standards and regulations are met. When you're helping clients analyze and action their path to sustainability, what really are some of the concepts and frameworks that resonate with you well in terms of helping clients understand the process beyond that box checking and really how to assess their values and understand their roadmap?
Yeah, I think that last bit is probably the most important, because one of the things I've noticed in my career is that there is a tendency to go too quickly to solutions. There's a tendency to go straight to, this is the product that I'm being offered, this is what I'm being sold. And one of the things we encourage everybody, not just the small mid-sized asset owners, but the asset managers and the companies, to think much, much harder about what it is that they're trying to achieve, where they are positioned, and what sorts of resources and skills and everything do they have to actually make a difference, and then to start to think about where this all fits in with their objectives. And it's part of the reason why the team we have is a mixture of people. So there's a couple of us who have investing backgrounds, but we've got someone who's a human rights specialist. We've got two people who are business psychologists, because a lot of what we're trying to do is to tease out the why, and the why is incredibly important, because if you don't understand the why, then you run a real risk of two things. One is the greenwashing challenge, and I think that's pretty well known. But the other one is what we describe as green wishing. And it's that whole thing about, you so much want there to be a solution that you're prepared to believe, or you're prepared to accept this solution that seems to offer you something that has no pain, there's no compromise required, and it's going to get you what you want. And it's not until you actually do the why and you start to dig down into it much more deeply, the why of what you want to do and the mechanism, the technologies, you start to think, well, hang on a minute, that doesn't really work. That doesn't really give me what I want. And we find that process is really quite powerful for particularly for asset owners, but right across the chain. And it helps them avoid that buyer's regret that, they end up with a product, but it really isn't giving them what they want. And it helps them start to think much more deeply about what it is they want and start to be more demanding with the asset owners, with the asset managers.
I can imagine. And it's interesting you touch on greenwashing and green wishing. I see a lot of sustainability reporting having a bit of disclaimer at the top or, at the end, noting that this is a wish list. The language used is to identify, a wish list rather than a plan or an understanding of the why attached. So I appreciate that. You spoke a little bit about your team and the holistic nature of, all of the different perspectives that are covered. I'd like to know more about, how your previous positions inform your work as an activist investor, and a little bit, if you could touch on the definition of an activist investor and what they do in the investment space.
Yeah, so I was really lucky. I spent about 8 years working for an organization that was truly activist. And by that, I mean that we worked with the board and we worked with the management team to try and drive some sort of change. And often the change, going back a bit, the change that we were trying to drive was financial or risk or where the company was going to be positioned. But you learn very quickly, particularly when you're doing this in Europe, that what you're doing is actually persuasion. That there's no mileage at all in demanding something or having a public spat with a company. That actually the best way to really deliver progress is to know the company or to know the operation really, really well, to understand in quite a lot of detail where you want them to be. And then to use that persuasive technique, to use questions and to use discussions to try and push them in the right direction and to start them thinking about what it is that they can be doing. And the best feeling of satisfaction you get is, 2 to 3 years later, they read back to you your plan, but it's their plan. And that's when you know you've got it. And I think it's a little bit different in the US, but I think here in Europe, you definitely make much more progress working that way. And so my firm belief is that engagement and activism are much more than just voting. You've really got to put the work in, and you've really got to be prepared to get down into the weeds of how does a company actually work. And it applies just as much to sustainability as it does to any other aspect of investing engagement, because if you want, a lot of what we think about in terms of sustainability is preparing a company for the future that we think is coming. And that means changing their risk profile. It means thinking about the possibility that certain things are going to happen that could materially damage their business, or alternatively, things are going to happen that could be brilliant opportunities. And thinking about those can be really quite hard for companies because they're brought up in a world where everyone measures them in the short term. Everyone looks at their quarterly results. Everyone looks at how they're going against guidance, how they're going against expectations. And sometimes, often, making those longer term choices requires trade-offs and compromises. And sometimes you have to trade off short-term performance. And getting to do that can be career limiting. And so you've got to help them build that narrative, a word we use a lot, that narrative that describes why this is better for long-term value creation. Although we talk about sustainability, a lot of what we're doing isn't doing the right thing because it's the right thing to do. A lot of what we talk about is doing the right thing because actually it makes good commercial sense. Now, it makes good commercial sense in the long run, not the short run. You might make more money by continuing to pollute or whatever it is you do. But long run, that's going to catch up with you. And we know as investors that actually the bulk of the value is created more than 5 years out. And so that is where we focus a lot of our time and efforts.
Right. As someone who is helping to assess a client's financial return, you've also noted that while it's possible to be green and to make a profit, it's not always guaranteed. So in a similar vein, could you share some key examples or methods that you've seen that really help maximize that investment edge and also help meet sustainability objectives and ROI?
Yeah, I think this is going to sound a bit weird and maybe a little bit controversial because so many investors talk about how sustainability and ESG investing is different. And I understand what they're trying to say, but in a way, it isn't that different. In our minds, it's the same kind of skill set that we have always used. And perhaps to illustrate it, people talk about how a lot of sustainability and ESG issues are soft. You can't measure them. They don't go into the P&L and the balance sheet. But then so do a whole stack of other issues that we have always included in valuation. So intangibles and brand value and the ability to innovate and your ability to retain your best staff. These are all things that we've always included. Microsoft is not the value of Microsoft isn't from just the assets. The value of Microsoft is the way they run the business and the brand they have, the innovation they're able to bring to the market, the kind of choices they make. These are soft things. You don't put them into a spreadsheet. And ESG and sustainability is very similar. So you start to think about going forward, what are going to be the big opportunities and what are going to be the big risks? And you have to start thinking about human rights, for instance. If you've got human rights issues in your supply chain, I probably couldn't put a value on that in a dollars and cents way, but I can certainly we can create a really interesting narrative around the kind of damage that can do to a company in the long run. Not just the legal costs, but if consumers decide they don't want to buy your product, or your business customers decide that they don't want to be trading with you, you've got a problem. And that could be in 2, 3, 4 years' time. So these things are hard to fix, and so you've got to start now. So that's a lot of what we talk to people about is, it's a bit like brand. You wouldn't expect to be able to fix your brand tomorrow. ESG and sustainability is the same thing. You've got to start now, and you've got to work at it over a period of years to get that resilience into your business. And you've seen a lot over the last few years, the last year or so. If you don't have a resilient business model, your value is rapidly diminishing.
Right. I know we've spoken a little bit about ESG being a broad church, and I definitely agree with that. With such a rapidly shifting regulation and disclosure landscape, and of course, this isn't a little morning check-in. But having a landscape that is shifting so rapidly, it does require that flexibility and well-integrated, sustainability methods and leadership. And I'm curious, we've touched on this a little bit, but if we could dig a little deeper on, how the financial sector incentivizes or can incentivize more impactful and focused CSR decision-making or ESG decision-making on a global, oh my goodness, today is the morning, today is the day, on a more local and global scale.
Yeah, I think some of this will take place through the sort of forums that we're seeing, and it'll take place through regulation, it'll take place through better reporting. But I do think, and this is at the core of what we try to do, I do think the absolute key here is around client education. Because I think we've got all sorts of challenges coming up that are becoming really quite apparent around, and we need to make sure our clients are better informed. We're now well past that point where there are pain-free solutions that we can just flick a switch and go into, that everything is going to have a compromise, everything is going to have a trade-off, and everything is probably going to have impacts on people's returns, on investors' returns. And so I think that it's really important that as an industry, we have a much more grown-up isn't the right word perhaps, but it's, that kind of thing. We have a much more grown-up conversation with our clients that say there are lots of choices that are coming up. Some of those choices might mean that you can protect your financial returns, but you'll compromise your values. Is that something you are comfortable with? Or alternatively, you can make choices that might give you slightly lower returns in the short run, but position you better in the long run and help align with your values. But we need to be honest that they are choices. These are not givens where you can have everything. This is not Alice in Wonderland where I can magically give you high returns and alignment with your values and high resilience all at the same time. It's not really a set that squares off very well. So I think education of the clients is a really important one. And education works both ways. I think one of the things that we try and do is by working with the asset owners, then they're in a much better position to go back to the asset managers and say, actually, we want solutions that do this. We know there's a trade-off, and I know it's becoming a harder debate in the US than it is here in Europe. There's a lot of people saying fiduciary duty, maximizing the financial return is the only thing you should be thinking about. But for many clients, particularly the sort of people we deal with, they are prepared to make those trade-offs if you explain to them why. And education is key.
Right. You mentioned a lot of choices to be made, a lot of variables around the corner. And in the spirit of globality, just a little bit of both here, because it will touch on a local and global scale, but we have the United States IRA bill being passed with the largest climate spending package in US history. The EU is starting to unveil plans to accelerate a transition to renewable energy, wean off Russian gas by 2027. And meanwhile, we have COP27 around the corner. It feels like COP27 or COP26 just ended. And there is going to be an inevitable assessment of global SDGs. So with so many shifting pieces at play, what sustainable investment trends and challenges do you foresee heading into 2023 if you had to narrow a few down?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question because there's obviously a lot of excitement, particularly in the US, about the Inflation Reduction Act, and that's understandable because it is dramatic. I guess I have a niggling worry, and I've been doing this a long time, and maybe it's made me cynical. But there is always, in my experience, there is always a gap between the expectations and the hopes of a government in terms of its subsidies and its programs and how they actually play out on the ground. And some of that is to do with the fact that decision-making by governments can be slow, and programs take a long time to set up, and then you get a change in government in one way, shape, or form, or it subtly alters. But the other thing too is that corporates, companies, and this is not a criticism, this is just the reality. Companies are really good at looking at the act and looking at the subsidy program and saying, well, actually, I can have a piece of that. I can not bend it because that sounds something slightly dishonest, but I can make this work for me. And so as we go from the act to the implementation to the actual real stuff on the ground, I suspect it's probably not going to quite work out the way that people expect. I think that the other point is one of the many things I've learned over the last 30 years is that government action on their own doesn't make a bad business or a bad technology profitable. Mm-hmm. And I think that there's quite a few things in both the European and the US programs that they give a bit of concern from an investing perspective. Right. If I take an example in the US, there's a lot of money going to go into carbon capture. Mm-hmm. I came out of the gas industry many, many years ago, but, I worked in the gas industry and we used carbon capture a lot. We know the technology works. It's proven, it's been used for decades, but it's proven and worked for decades in a certain set of situations, a certain application. And from what I have seen, there's very little evidence, there's very little working systems that show that it can work in the type of situation that we're looking at on a fossil fuel powered, a gas or a coal-fired power station. So that's going to be a massive technical challenge. And my worry is that regardless of the amount of money that gets thrown at it, it's not a problem that can be solved, at least not in a way that gives us the kind of solutions that we think we're going to get. And then if you flip to Europe, the Europeans have decided that nuclear and gas are a transition fuel. Well, having worked in the finance industry, I know what that's probably going to mean in practice. It means that banks and financial institutions will be lending money into these programs because they're going to be the sort of thing that gets the nice ESG tech. And yet that's probably not the way that most investors, most asset owners think that their money will be used. And so whatever way it works out, some money will be taken out of things that could be solving the problem in the long run to go into something that is politically expedient. The really interesting thing, though, coming up is I think that there's going to be a lot more interest in systems. Okay, and one way to think about this is historically, we have thought about sustainability and green transitions as being about physical things. It's been about solar, it's been about wind farms, it's been about EVs. And I think what's going to be really interesting over the next year or 2 years is going to be there is a gradual and accelerating emergence of the technologies that take all of those things, those physical objects, and integrate them together with either smart systems or some sort of software. And they create something that's much, much bigger and much more valuable than the sum of the parts. And somebody, and I can't remember their name, so I apologize to them in advance, somebody pointed out that Tesla was actually that. Tesla has created a very valuable a highly valued company, put it that way, out of technologies that aren't really that clever. But what they've found a brilliant way of doing is bringing them all together in one way, in one shape, in a solution that gives people what they want. And we're starting to see the emergence of that in all sorts of industries, such as, we're seeing it in the electricity grid network, where you're putting together demand management and smart systems and all of those technologies that help the grid work more efficiently. Because one of the things that we find a lot when we talk to investors is they go, well, the solution is more wind farms, or it's more solar, or it's more this. And you go, yeah, but the electricity grid can't cope with it at the moment. So you need to invest in interconnectors. You need to invest in battery storage. You need to invest in making the grid more resilient and more reliable. These are systems-based solutions. And that, I think, is going to be where the real value is. And you can think of all sorts of other examples in terms of electric vehicle charging and agriculture and all of those things. But that's the one I think is going to emerge quite quickly over the next couple of years.
That's fascinating. And you could tell me if this relates or not, but I remember hearing that I think the green technology and sustainability market was estimated to be worth roughly 10.9 billion in 2021 and might reach around 44.4 billion in 2028, something like that. So I think there is definitely a correlation at play. There seems to be a lot on the table as far as systems are concerned. And I think you raise really good points regarding the youth of the ESG space and how there is just a lot of variables that we can't quite predict, a lot of data that isn't quite present yet to understand the real outcome. So I appreciate your insight there. If anyone is interested in speaking further, and I imagine many might be, but or if anyone has any follow-up questions based on this conversation, what would be the best way to connect with you and your team?
I think probably the obvious one is through our website. So we're
always a good one.
Obviously the www bit, but we're sustainableinvesting.co.uk, and there's much more information about the team on that, and there's much more information about how to contact us. Obviously, the other one is promoting the alternative software one is LinkedIn. My LinkedIn profile, lots of people have reached out on that one, and there's been a lot of interest in getting in touch with me that way. The other thing that people can do is to follow our blog. So we've written on a lot of these topics, or probably I've been writing on this now for probably 5 years, 6 years. But we're in the process of moving ourselves to Substack, and we're branding ourselves there as the sustainable investor. And so people can get in touch with us that way, and they can follow what we're writing and what we're saying. And I guess the last obvious one is good old-fashioned email, which is stephen@sustainableinvesting.co.uk. But we're more than happy to chat to people and see if we can help them. And because I think it's a really exciting time to be a sustainable investor. It's not going to be easy, but there's so many opportunities coming along now where you can earn a fair financial return, but at the same time make a real difference. And I think that's what we're trying to help people to do.
That's great. Thank you, Steven. Thank you for ending on that note.
Pleasure. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. We'll share all of those platforms. Make sure to check those out in the flyout as well. Thank you for tuning into this episode of the OETV ESG interview series. We'll be back with another exclusive interview, more one-of-a-kind ESG related research content, and of course, highlight the best of OETV ESG today. Until then, I'm Sasha Chasen. Mind your ESGs, take care, and stay safe.